Imagine a world divided not by borders or languages, but by ideology. This was the chilling reality of the Cold War, a conflict that began in the aftermath of World War II. As the embers of the Second Great War cooled, the world's superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, found themselves locked in a tense and precarious balance of power. In the early days of 1945, the leaders of these superpowers gathered at what was known as the Yalta Conference. Here, President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Premier Stalin discussed the post-war reorganization of Europe. But the seeds of the Cold War were inadvertently sown in these discussions as the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union became starkly apparent. A few months later, the world mourned the death of President Roosevelt. His successor, President Truman, would soon find himself navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy at the Potsdam Conference. During this meeting, the Allied leaders discussed post-war Europe, but tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to emerge, hinting at the looming Cold War. 1946 saw Winston Churchill deliver his famous Iron Curtain speech. His words echoed across the globe, warning of the growing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Later that year, the United States presented the Baruch Plan for nuclear disarmament to the United Nations, but the Soviet Union flatly rejected it. This further deepened the rift between the two superpowers, setting the stage for the decades-long ideological conflict known as the Cold War. As the world watched with bated breath, the stage was set for a conflict unlike any other. As the 1940s rolled into the 1950s, the Cold War escalated. The world was now split into two camps, the US and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its satellite states. The Truman Doctrine, announced in March of 1947, pledged US support for countries resisting communism. This was a clear message to the Soviet Union that the US would stand against the spread of communism. A few months later, in June, the Marshall Plan was announced. This was an offer of economic aid to war-torn Europe, with the US hoping to rebuild these nations and prevent them from falling into the Soviet sphere of influence. The USSR, however, saw this as an attempt by the US to extend its influence. By 1948, tensions had reached a boiling point. In June, the Soviet Union initiated the Berlin blockade, halting all traffic to West Berlin. The Western allies, refusing to be intimidated, responded with the Berlin airlift, supplying West Berlin by air. That same year in May, the State of Israel was declared, leading to the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict. This event further complicated the geopolitical landscape, adding another layer of complexity to the Cold War. Next came the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in April of 1949. This was a military alliance formed to counter Soviet aggression. The Soviet Union responded to this perceived threat by testing its first atomic bomb in August, effectively ending the US monopoly on nuclear weapons. The decade closed with a momentous event, the proclamation of the People's Republic of China by Mao Zedong in October. This signaled the rise of a new communist power, further deepening the divide between the two Cold War camps. The world was now firmly in the grip of the Cold War, and there was no turning back. The 1960s were a time of high stakes and near misses, a time when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Let's first journey back to the year 1950. The Korean War had just begun, marking another significant chapter in this geopolitical chess game. This conflict, which lasted until 1953, ended not with a peace treaty, but an armistice, leaving the Korean peninsula divided to this day. In the midst of this, 1953 saw the death of the Soviet Union's iron-fisted leader, Joseph Stalin. His passing marked the rise of Nikita Khrushchev, a man known for his passionate speeches and fiery temper. This change in leadership, however, did little to quell the escalating tensions. 2 years later, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact was formed. This military alliance, comprising the Soviet Union and 7 Eastern European countries, was a direct response to the formation of NATO, further deepening the East-West divide. The following year, The Hungarian uprising was crushed by Soviet forces, underscoring the Soviet Union's iron grip on Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Cuban Revolution was unfolding. By 1959, Fidel Castro had come to power, establishing a communist regime just 90 miles from U.S. shores. Then came the U-2 incident in 1960, when an American spy plane was shot down over Soviet airspace. This event heightened tensions, pushing the world closer to the edge of nuclear confrontation. 1961 saw the construction of the infamous Berlin Wall, a stark and concrete symbol of the ideological divide. But it was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 that really brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. For 13 nerve-wracking days, the prospect of nuclear annihilation hung over the world like a dark cloud. But somehow, humanity pulled back from the brink. In 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, banning all test detonations of nuclear weapons except for those conducted underground. In the face of such peril, the world held its breath, hoping for a peaceful resolution. The 1970s and 1980s brought a period of détente, a temporary thawing of the Cold War tensions. This era was marked by significant events that changed the course of history. Among these was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT I, in 1972. These talks between the United States and the Soviet Union sought to curb the arms race, marking a pivotal point in the relations between the two superpowers. In 1975, the Helsinki Accords were signed, including the recognition of Europe's post-World War II borders. This was another step towards easing tensions, but it was not enough to prevent the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. This invasion triggered a new wave of conflict and tension, making the end of the Cold War seem far from reach. The 1980s saw the election of Ronald Reagan as the President of the United States. Reagan's hardline stance against the Soviet Union marked a shift in U.S. foreign policy. His famous Evil Empire speech in 1983 painted the Soviets as the villains of the world stage, fueling the tensions further. In the same year, the Able Archer NATO exercise almost triggered a nuclear war. This was a simulated military exercise that the Soviets misinterpreted as a real attack. The world teetered on the brink of a nuclear catastrophe, reminding everyone of the high stakes of the Cold War. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the Soviet Union. His policies of glasnost and perestroika, meaning openness and restructuring, signaled a change in the Soviet Union's approach. Gorbachev sought to reform the Soviet Union from within, while also improving its relations with the West. The world watched as the Cold War began to thaw, but the end was not yet in sight. The 1990s marked the end of an era. The Cold War, a conflict that had shaped the world for almost half a century, was finally coming to an end. This resolution was not sudden, but a result of a series of significant events that began in the late 1980s. One of the most pivotal moments was the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, in 1987. This landmark agreement between Reagan and Gorbachev, the leaders of the two superpowers, was a step towards reducing the nuclear threat that loomed over the world. The treaty eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, marking a shift in the dynamics of the Cold War. However, the true turning point came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The once mighty superpower was fragmented into 15 separate countries. This seismic event symbolized the end of the Cold War, as the ideological battle between capitalism and communism lost one of its key players. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was followed by the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, known as START I and II. These treaties were a further effort to limit the number of strategic nuclear weapons, signifying a move towards global disarmament and a departure from the arms race that had characterized the Cold War. Yet, it's important to note that the end of the Cold War did not mean the end of geopolitical tension and conflict. The post-Cold War world saw the rise of new powers and challenges, including terrorism, economic inequalities, and environmental issues. And so the Cold War ended, Not with a bang, but with a whisper. The world had changed irrevocably, its course altered by this silent conflict.